Okay, so as ever, for the benefit of the recording, this is the code along session for IDS. This is week 6. Just as a sort of admin note, I suspect we're not going to run a code along next week because it's a little bit of a sort of more hands-off week anyway, talking about data ethics. There's less I can sort of make a code along relevant, and also it will give us chance. This is with the project proposals and the re-proposals and homework too. There's a lot of marking and feedback involved in other ways. So to compensate for that, we may well not run a code along. But we are running one this week. It's going to be about web scraping-ish. Or getting data from the web, or more generally different ways you can get data. And I'm being a bit vague in that for a good reason. And I'll tell you why. So my original plan for this is the little story that we're going to start with. My original plan for this code along was that I was going to, and I think I said this at the end of video 1, was that I was going to go to the data set that we looked at in video 1, which was about who'd won Emmys, and that had been scraped from the Emmys website, and I was going to go and re-scrape that data because because there was a problem with it. I think some of the things from 2014 hadn't been captured properly, so we had an incomplete data set. And that was great until, and let me just find the relevant bit of the website. Can't find it now. So I decided to do the standard things that the web scraping information tells you to do when you're planning to scrape a website. So the first thing it tells you to do is to oh, yeah, there it is. So the first thing it tells you to do is to use the robots.txt to check whether or not a site has a thing that bans bots or bans scraping tools from scraping a website. And I tried that on the Emmys website, and it said true, which means there was no problem. It was fine to scrape it in theory. But because I was recording this, I thought it was best to make absolutely sure. So I had a look at the website terms and conditions, which I'm not sure many people read, but I read them. So I'll just share with you what those say. If I stop working in mind, I'll just read them to you. So what it says is, except as may be explicitly permitted through this site, you agree not to save, download, cut and paste, sell, license, rent, lease, modify, distribute, copy, reproduce, transmit, publicly display, publicly perform, publish, adapt, edit, or create derivative works from materials, code, or content on or from the site. And here's the key bit: systematic retrieval of data or other content from this site to create or compile, directly or indirectly, a collection, compilation, database, or directory without written permission from the company is prohibited. Now, I don't have written permission from the Television Academy to scrape from their website. Maybe if I'd thought about this sooner, I could have written to them. I'm not sure they'd have replied to me in any sort of timescale that was practical, at least. So I wanted a new plan. And I tried lots of different websites. You'll see that I tried, if you look at the repo for the project, you'll see that I was originally going to get some stuff from the History of Science Museum in Oxford. It turned out when I actually tried to scrape that, that was fine. It was totally allowed as far as I could tell. But when I tried to do it, the way the website was formatted meant that you couldn't easily scrape it because it was dynamically generating content, and the things that the selection helper selection gadget, were telling me to use just didn't translate, because when you got the page using the original read HTML, it didn't get any of the dynamic content. It only got the static content of the website, which didn't include any of the items that I was trying to get. So I started thinking about other approaches. And what I've decided to talk about is, I think in the videos, Mina talks a little bit about the other way of getting data from the internet, which is to use what's known as an API. So an API stands for, an API stands for, I should know this, Application Programming Interface. So in other words, application program. So what it means is a way that a program can talk to another program, or talk to a website, or talk to a server, or something like that. So lots of things have these. Often you have to pay for access to them, but for some of them you don't. And a really classic one that you don't have to pay for, because you don't have to pay for anything related to it, is Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has various different APIs, both that belong to the software that makes Wikipedia and the software that makes Wikipedia, which is called MediaWiki, and sort of the organization itself and things that it's made available. And it turns out, when I researched this and looked at whether it'd be suitable to talk about, that it's actually really easy to get data from this if you know like 3 lines of code. There are 3 lines of code that you need to be able to do this, and then it just works. So I thought I'd sort of take you through doing that a little bit today. So I'm going to go relatively slowly because you won't have seen any of this before. Don't worry if you don't recognize the code. And I'm going to give you one extra little instruction if I can, which is, I know this is called a code along, but this is probably an occasion where I'm going to ask you not to code along live, for the reason that if we get lots of people all making the same requests to the API that MediaWiki owns, they might think that we're carrying out some sort of distributed denial of service attack and block access, or it might even succeed and shut down. So it would be, again, when we're talking about ethics, it would be irresponsible of me to say, everyone go do this at the same time. So I'm going to do it. By all means, go and have a look and have a go at this afterwards, because then it'll, not everyone's going to do it at the same time, but please don't do it live. So with all that said, let me get the project up, as I usually do. So that was a little story to start with, and the explanation of why we're doing something a bit weird this week. So here it is. You can see that this was, I forgot to update this when I changed my plan for the second time, because this is still in the History of Science Museum, so I'm going to replace that with new intro later. And what we're going to do is go into this scraping script R file I've made. So as Mina talks about, it's a good idea to put your scraping scripts in a separate file rather than your main MD file. Does anyone out of interest remember why that is? So why should I put this in a .r file as opposed to a .rmd file?
Answers in chat as always.
Yes. Correct, yeah. So every time we click knit, this script will run if we put it in the RMD file, and that will run it every time. So every time it will send a new request to MediaWiki servers to get the information. And that's at best impolite, because it's creating server load that's just not necessary. And actually the data we're going to get aren't going to be changing. So, it might be that you might want to run something like once a day if you were getting live data. And again, if the website allowed you to do that. But I'm going to look at data from the year 2020. And that obviously finishes on the 31st of December 2020. And so we're not going to talk about anything beyond that. These data are now going to be fixed and changing. There's a few packages you need for this, and I'm not sure if they're all installed. So I'm going to just run these. If they're not, I'll go and fix that later and make sure that they are installed for use if you want to copy this. But let's try. So
remember, if you are using the IDS 2021/22, because we still get questions about this, in the top left, you can see that Alex is using IDS 21/22. We pre-install the packages on that space. So you don't have to. That's kind of why, if your tidyverse isn't running or something like that, the first thing that we'll tell you is double check that's in that space, because we manage the environment for you. So it's a little bit quicker and a little bit easier for you to get started. So that's what Alex is referring to there.
And I meant to do all of these. It may be that I've forgotten to do one or two of these. So let's just see. So I'm going to put tidyverse in as usual. And then the two we need for dealing with this API are called HTTR and JSON Lite. And apparently I did install them. Excellent. So those are the three things we're going to need. And then the main function we need for doing this web scraping is one called get. All in caps, get. And we're going to put something in here. And actually, a lot of APIs will have documentation, will have help available for how to use them. And there's no exception in Wikipedia. So I want to tell you the plan for this. What I want to do is I want to look at the countries in Europe. I'm interested in page views for articles about countries in Europe. So this is going to be a two-stage process. Firstly, Wikipedia articles are sorted into categories, and there is a category called countries in Europe. So I want to go into that category and I want to extract all of the articles that belong to the category countries in Europe. So I've then got a list of articles that I need to get data about. And then want to know the page views for that for every day from the 1st of January 2020 to the end of 2020. 31st of December. So those are slightly different queries. I want first a list of all of the names of articles of countries in Europe. And then secondly, I want to, for each of those articles, get the number of pages. So let's start with the first one. So as I say, there's no reason a priori you would know how to do this. I didn't know exactly what I need to put in either. It will vary depending on the API, but fortunately they've got really good documentation on here. So this is the page that tells you about how to scrape categories. And let's just have a play around with this. So let's have a look at this. So I'm going to put the link in the chat if anyone wants to have a look at this. That is the link. And it is, oh, I've linked to the wrong one. This is categories associated with a page or pages. Never mind. Wrong one. That's the one I want. Category members, so pages that belong to a given category. It gives us an example. So here's an example request. List 20 pages in a category. So if we click on that, we get an output. Okay, so what we're going to do is, for now, I'm just going to change things in the URL up at the top here. Well, now let's change them on here and copy and paste it in. So if I want to get, let me just copy this. So that's the wrong, completely the wrong R file. There we go. Sorry, I went to my version of RStudio rather than the cloud one. So let's just put in here the sample one. So can anyone see anything that I want to change here?
You mean anything like change physics, change number of
so change
pages?
Yeah. So what should I change physics to here? What do you think is going to be the right answer?
Have you told us what you want us to change it to? Right.
So
answer. Could it be anything?
I'm looking for countries in Europe.
Oh,
I'm looking to get a list of countries in Europe, and I can tell you that there's a Wikipedia category called countries in Europe. The answer is relatively. I've said the phrase that I'm looking for someone to put in the chat like twice. This isn't a trick question. I'm looking for countries in Europe. Yeah, countries in Europe. Thank you. But yes, good point on the number as well. So, good question. Good question. Does this need to be in a code chunk? The answer is no. So because we're dealing with an R script here, that doesn't really have any concept of code chunks. So when you're writing your scraping scripts, and this is true for when you're doing the ones where you're web scraping in the way Mina's taught you in the videos, when you're doing the scraping, you're going to do it in an R file, and R files are literally just code. You can write comments like I've done here, which begin with a hash, but you can't write the sort of analysis around them. It's purely code. And there's no such concept as a code chunk. So you really do just write your code. It should be nicely laid out, probably, with nice spaces to separate things and maybe comments as titles. But you wouldn't put a code chunk now. The other thing I'm using, by the way, is, and I use this at the beginning, and this is a really useful trick for when you're doing anything in R, is to hold down Control and press Enter. And that runs one line of code. And that's true whether we're in a code chunk or in an R file. If you're on a Mac, it's Command and Enter rather than Control. So yeah, we want countries in Europe. And as it happens, I'll give you this hint. You have to put underscores in, which if you look at a Wikipedia article's URL, you'll see that there are underscores in there. And yeah, there are more than 20 countries in Europe. So I'm actually going to bump that to just 100 because I don't know exactly what it's going to give me. And I'm pretty sure it will give me fewer than 100 things. How do you get the selected gadgets that I talked about in the video, someone asks? Good question. So I've got it as a little bookmark here. I can use it on RStudio if I want, though it won't be very helpful. There is a, David, could you link to the website that you can use to install that in the chat? But you just install it. And you can either install it as a Chrome add-on, or I don't really use Chrome, I use Firefox. So with Firefox, what you do is they give you a URL and you store that URL as a bookmark. So you essentially bookmark a page, but it's not really a page. So this, you see at the top here, I've got all of my bookmarks through the various things with the university. And this bookmark here isn't really a bookmark. It's a thing that makes select gadget appear, but it's stored as a bookmark. Okay, so we want to change its country in Europe and 100. And if I try running that, it's not going to fully work. And I'll tell you why it's not going to work. If we look here, it says, so this is again what I just clicked on. This is what Wikipedia just provided me. This is the HTML representation of the JSON format. HTML is good for debugging, but is unsuitable for application use. Specify the format parameter to change the output format to see the non-HTML representation of the JSON format set format equals JSON. So that gives me the hint that what I want to do is put and format equals JSON. So half of the, when you're working with an API, half of the battle is trying to work out what query you should give it and work out what the format of the query is. And we've just done that. So the next thing, as I say, everything, once you've got the query, the next thing is 3 lines of code, and it's the same 3 lines of code for whenever you want to do this. The get function is the thing that's doing the equivalent of read HTML. It's going to that and it's storing that. And what you want to do, your 3 lines of code, I'll tell you what, well, let's see what res is. Let's look at what the object is. Well, that's not very helpful. I'll just make my screen a bit bigger as well. Should have done that earlier. But res is something. But I'm going to tell you as well, I didn't just magically know how to do this. I looked this up. I'm telling you what the answer is now, but I looked this up. I didn't. There wasn't some magical way that I knew how to do this. But if you want to do this, if you want to do looking for Wikipedia data, say you could use the say to get page view data for topics that are in your data set that you've chosen for your project. You could get, say, the page views on Wikipedia and join that in, and you'd have some more data to analyze. So that might be something you might want to use this for. But what we want to do is, it turns out the thing we want is the content. And what this is here, this isn't very useful. So does anyone recognize what these numbers are? What kind of numbers these are, just out of interest? This is not on the course, so I'm just curious. Yes, hexadecimal. Yeah. So these are hexadecimal numbers. So these are numbers in base 16 as opposed to base 10. And they're representing text. And it turns out what you need to do, and again, I looked up how to do this. I didn't magically know it. The function is raw to car. And what that does is get something that looks a lot better now. So now we're getting lots of names of countries like Luxembourg, like Moldova, like North Macedonia. And this incidentally gets us back into the question, sort of again in the data science, like ethics and thinking about your data question. It has everything that Wikipedia considers to be a country in Europe. which includes things that, so like Kosovo is recognized as a country by some countries in the world, but not by others, because Serbia considers the territory of Kosovo to be part of Serbia. And some countries support that claim, and some countries support Kosovo's claim to be its own country. And Wikipedia has decided, therefore, that Kosovo is a country, but that's a decision some people might disagree with. So you've always got to be careful when dealing with like country data, for instance, because the list of countries will depend on who made it, basically, and what their opinions were. Okay, so this is looking better, and it turns out the third thing we need is from JSON.
So it's worth noting all of those, what you were showing before, was it looks so weird because it was a JSON file that you were printing to the console, right?
Yeah. So this was what's called a JSON file, which is a structured form of data that is literally just printed all in one line. So it's basically illegible. And what from JSON does, it just takes that and makes a table out of it. And there we have. So this isn't a tibble as it happens. It's a data frame. It's a base R data frame, but it has everything we want. It's a little bit. It's a little bit buried because if you see here, it says $query $category members is the sort of title of this. So we can get that out. So what we can do is put, I'm just going to store that as temp for now. There are there are neater ways to do this, but the simplest way is to do Europe data is then temp $query $category members. Oh, never saved that. So control enter there, control enter there. And now what we have is our Europe data. So this probably looked very alien. Like I've just shown you some code you've never seen before. You shouldn't have, there's no way you would have known how to do this. I'm not expecting you to. What I do want to say though, is that these 3 lines of code will, after you've done any sort of get of a JSON, those 3 lines of code will get you a list that contains a nice table that you can just extract by doing this. So that's
is that only with Wikipedia, or is that with any website?
So as long as what you're extracting is a JSON file. So, and I made it a JSON file by putting the let's see, what did I put? And format equals JSON. So that's what a JSON file looks like in a browser. So this is the ones in the physics category, obviously. But as long as it's a JSON file, that will work. So this is why I sort of wanted to talk about this, because as I say, it turns out it's way easier than I thought it was. Because as long as you know those 3 lines of code, so get a thing using this get function, then res $content, pipe to raw to character, raw to car, pipe to from JSON, and you get a list that contains a data frame that you want, which you can then extract. Any quick questions on that while we're here? Because that's most of, that's sort of the main new thing from today. And then things that we're going to see now are going to be things you've seen before. So what get does is it is the equivalent for getting a, it's sort of API equivalent version of read_HTML. So read HTML goes onto the internet and stores the content of an HTML file in R as something. And get is doing the same and storing it under storing whatever the output is under res. What did I add to the URL to make it JSON? What I added to the URL was and format equals JSON. And the reason I knew to do that was that it told me. If I go back here, it says set format equals JSON. And the extra thing I need to know is that these things that are separated by question marks and ands are essentially settings to an HTML query. So I guessed, to be honest, but I saw that it said, things like in the sample one, it said CL limit equals 100, and it told me somewhere to put format equals JSON. It told me that, let's say right there. And so I thought, oh, if I put and format equals JSON, then it'll probably work. And it did.
If you put and format equals JSON on any website, would it work?
No. So this one is a specific thing from the way that the MediaWiki API works. So this is where, up to this point, this is where you need to look at the documentation for whichever API you're trying to use and make sure that, you know, and see how you send queries to it. And what it will usually be is there'll be a set of like parameters here. So all of these things on the end are a little bit like arguments to an R function. And it's always question mark, something equals something, and something equals something, and CM limit equals 100, by the way, was, again, that's a specific thing for this API, but that parameter is how many things do you want to, so CM stands for category member in this case. So it's setting a max of what it will give me. And as it happens, actually, that wasn't everything, because if we look here, it's run out, because there are, at the end, it's listing subcategories of the main category. So as well as listing the article, like the articles for the countries, which are contained in this category on Wikipedia, there are also things like a category for each country, like category Kingdom of Denmark. And it's obviously run out here because it's got to category Lithuania, and Lithuania isn't the last country alphabetically in Europe. But we don't care. We're not interested in that because we only want just the names of the countries in Europe. What if you have data that updates over time? Can you get the code to reflect that? Yeah, you would have to. So I think there's ways in R to make it sort of run code every so often, but you could run the code again. I don't off the top of my head know how to sort of automate it so it would like run every day, for instance, but you can sync queries. The most important thing is to be ethical with it as usual. So, you know, don't, usually APIs will set limits or will say you need to be reasonable on the number of queries you can make, and you need to stay with that. But you could just rerun the code. The point is we're not going to now touch lines 5 to 7 again, because we've done that line now. We've got the thing under this name res, and we don't need to do it again. Okay, so please keep questions coming in the chat, but I'll answer them. But I want to just have a look at this data set because it's not quite right. It's nearly there. What's missing from this? So I'm just going to rename this.
Can you state what you were originally trying to do again?
So yeah, so what I'm trying to do is get the names of the Wikipedia articles for every country in Europe. And the reason we can't just do a list of countries in Europe is that, for instance, the article for the country Georgia is Georgia brackets country. And there was no way sort of to know that a priori, or to know that, you know, it's chosen to call it Czech Republic as opposed to Czechia, or, you know, things like that. So what's in here that shouldn't be in here? Well, I'll tell you what's in here that shouldn't be in here. All of this stuff at the end shouldn't be in here, right? These are not the names of articles for countries in Europe. These are other categories. Good joke, yeah. The UK is still on the continent of Europe. I think that was a joke. Apologies if it wasn't. But yeah, we are still on the continent of Europe. And Russia, for instance, is not in the European Union, but is in this list. Apologies if that wasn't a joke. I hope it was. So yeah, so the things that are by country we don't need, but there's actually something in common to all of them. Can you see what's in common to all of this stuff at the end? What? Any thoughts? Oh, the first thing I'm going to do, by the way, is this useful function as Tibble. Which is just to convert it into a Tibble rather than a data frame, because that's going to be easier to work with. But I'll do that first. But yeah, what do you notice about? Yes, very good. So we could strip the category, but we actually don't want these categories at all, in fact, because they're already up here as the names of the articles. We don't need the categories. So what could we use to get rid of which R command could be used to get rid of all of these categories. So starts with only works on column names. That's a really annoying thing about the tidyverse, because I frequently think starts with is what I need for this. You actually need to use one of the things from Stringer to deal with these things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Slice would work, but would be a little bit less robust to changes in the data. Say if some country, suppose Scotland declared independence from the United Kingdom, and we reran the script, there would now be another entry in here. Filter, very good, yeah. So what we can do is filter with, so let's have a look. So we want to filter by so there is a str start, so let's just check what that does. Yeah, sets the presence or absence of a pattern at the beginning of or end of a string. Really good. So str starts category. Except what's that going to do? What will this give me if I run this? Yes. Answer that question is, so we're not using code chunks because we're in a .r file. So actually at this point, we possibly could now switch to our main file because we've got our data scraped. The reason I'm not doing it yet is that what I would intend to do here is, so code chunks don't make sense in our file. It just doesn't understand them. It would see the 3 backticks and it would think. The reason we're not using code chunks, the reason we use is the same, therefore, as the reason that we're using a .r file as opposed to a .rmd file. And the reason we're using a .r file, and this is about the only time in the course we're going to ask you to use a .r file, is this web scraping stuff, is that for your web scraping, every time you knit a file, you rerun all of the code. And so you would rerun the line of code that I said I didn't want to touch again, which was this line. So what I would actually want to do is run this script to scrape all of the data, store that data somewhere, and then call that into my file where I do my analysis. Does that make sense? But yeah, going back to the other suggestion, yes, I need an exclamation mark there, because if I don't, there's a problem. I need to tell it which column I'm checking. Oops. Title category, and if I run that, it will only give me the things with categories. So I need the exclamation mark.
Alex, can you go back to that error and tell us how you figured that out?
Yeah, sure. So let me just get the error. So the error was this. So that's what I had. And it says, error, problem with filter input ... Input ... is str starts category. Argument pattern is missing with no default. Okay, so I looked at that and I thought, but the argument pattern isn't missing. I've given it the argument pattern. So something weird's happened here. And the reason is that I've not specified the arguments here by name, right? I haven't put pattern equals that. I've just put the value in. And when that happens, R assumes that I mean the first thing here. So it thinks I mean string. So it thinks that the string I want it to work on is this specific string. So the thing I'm wanting to test for is this. And it thinks the thing I want to test it with is missing because I've only given it one thing. So actually we get a slightly different argument if I put pattern, different error. If I put pattern equals category, which maybe I should have done, it will now say argument string is missing with no default. And maybe I should have done that. Maybe that's better coding. Because if I'd done that, I would have been able to spot the error much sooner. Or I wouldn't have had to think about, but the argument isn't missing. Because now it's telling me, yeah, the argument string is missing. And of course, the argument string is missing. I haven't given it a string. So now I need to put that in, and the string I wanted. So this is what thing do I want to test for? And what I want to test for is, excuse me, is the title column. And then, as we said, we needed the exclamation mark at the beginning to make it not that. So why can't we use string extract? Because regular expressions is a good answer. We could use string detect, and that would have regular expressions in. That would do very similar to str starts. The reason we can't use str extract, it would work perfectly fine, but let's see what happens. So if I do str extract, and what are the values for this? So, so if I run that, what it will do is it will, that will actually find the pattern that starts with category and extract that. And so we'll just get a column that says category, 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 which isn't what we want to do. You could use one that does sort of the opposite of str extract. So you could use one that removes anything that matches the, which is str remove, I think. Yeah, so we could use str remove. That would absolutely work and do something sensible. In theory. So what's the error here? Dot dot one must be a logical vector, not a character. Because this isn't a this now is not a so the problem, it says, is with the filter function, and the reason we can't use this now is that str remove isn't giving a true or false. It's not testing anything, it's actually trying to modify the data. So if we're trying to modify a column, we don't put it inside a filter. What do we put it inside?
In this case, we are not removing rows. We are altering.
Altering rows and making it, we would then have to say put those in new column. Yeah, mutate. Yeah. So if we did that, say we did a mutate, new title equals str remove. The thing is that that's not quite, that works, but it's not quite done what we wanted, because if we look at the end of the file, so let's just pipe that into view so I can see the whole thing. If we look at the end of the file, we've still got all of these entries, like organizations based in Europe by country, and that's not a country in Europe. And we've got these duplicate countries again. So it would work, it's just not what we want to do, because what we want to do here is get rid of all those rows. We don't want to just strip the category from them. We want to use that as a key to say, actually, this isn't what we want. This is surplus to our requirements. So what we want is filter, str starts, title, pattern equals category. And we're getting that. The only thing, so let's just pipe that into a view again so we can see it. So now this is looking good. These are all things that Wikipedia considers to be countries, with the exception of post-Soviet states and European microstates, which are sort of general articles about these topics, but they're not in themselves countries. So the easiest thing to do there is just, since there's only 2 of them, is just to get rid of them by hand. So we can put this inside a filter as well, because we want to then filter for something else. And what we want to filter for is country, title, let's say, it's going to be the quickest way to do this, probably not title in, and what were they, post-Soviet states and European. There we
Alex?
Go. Yeah.
Why did you put it in brackets after the exclamation mark? Does anyone want to jump in? Maybe help answer that question? Why is Alex using brackets there?
Let me get rid of them. What would that do? Would give an error, yeah. So what it would actually do is it would try and negate title, just the string title itself, the column title rather. You can't negate that. That's not a vector of true or false values. It's, yeah, exactly. It's not logical. It is a vector of character values. Yeah, and so what we want to do is actually, this is a logical statement. The thing that I put in brackets here is a logical statement, and we want to negate that. So in order to make R do that, we have to put that in brackets.
So what it's doing is it's then running what's inside the brackets first, essentially. You could think of it this way, and then negating that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's very much like brackets in mathematical operations, right? It's telling it that you want to do this bit first. Okay, so I think this is now ready for us to save this as, oh, it's not. There's one more thing I want to do. So the other thing I want to do, so do you remember that I said that you had to put these underscores in up here? So if we're ever going to make any other queries, and I'm not going to do this live because we're going to run out of time, but what I would like to do next, what I'd like to do with this, and it's the reason that you could say, if all I wanted was the list of data, what I could have done, if I wanted just the data I've already got, what I could have done was at this point here, saved this to file, and then loaded it from my other file and done all this work on it in the R&D file. The reason I didn't do that is that I want to still scrape some data after I've got this. So I need to do all of this modification to be able to do some more scraping. So I may as well put it in my general scraping or web accessing script. But do you remember I said that here we had to put underscores in countries in Europe? So in order to be able to iterate over our titles, what we're going to want to do is change those to have the underscores in. It will make our life much easier. So that's going to be mutate. And the function we want is str, any guesses? So I want to replace all of the spaces with underscores. If I scroll down those, tell me if you see one that might look good. Yeah, so actually it's not quite replaced, but that's a very good suggestion. I thought it was that until I tried it. And let's see what happens when we do that. So if I put str replace, so I'm going to call it, let's say, URL title, for want of a better name. So I want to replace my keys are going wrong. We want to replace, and if we look at the names of the arguments in str replace, we want to replace pattern equals space with the replacement being underscore. Someone's already put it in the chat why this isn't going to work. Yeah, we need replace all, and I'll show you. I did replace. I thought it was that, and you can see here why that doesn't work. Bosnia underscore and space Herzegovina. So we need to replace all. There we go. So now let's save that as your data. Whoops. So the next thing I would do after this is someone sent a Word document to the chat. I don't know if you meant to.
I am also definitely not going to open that.
That's okay. It's okay, don't worry. I was just confused. We're coming actually towards the end because officially this ends at 10:02 and I never actually pay attention to that. But let's have a think about where we'd go from here. So we've now got our data. So I'm going to talk about what I'm not going to do any more coding live. I'll quickly write this up afterwards. We're going to use this version of the API, which is the page views one. That's what we do. And it, again, helpfully gives us lots of examples of how to use this. So our example it gives here is October 2015, Albert Einstein. So you do need to read this and have a look at how it works. So if we break this down, it's going to be that it gives us, and this is a different format already. You can see here that this is a, you can see already here that this is a different format from the other one. So there's none of the ampersands and question marks here. There's just lots of slashes in it instead. And it's giving you examples to get an idea of how it works. So it's saying that, for instance, page views per article, which is what we're going to want, the English Wikipedia, which is what we want. These things are to do with who's accessing the website. So, excuse me, this one is to do with mobile access. This one is to do with whether or not humans or bots are accessing the website. This tells us the name of the article, so that's the thing we're going to plug in from our list of things daily. And then this is a bit weird, but this here is a string of numbers, and you might ask what on earth is going on here. And the clue is that this is October 2015. So if we look, that's, I can't click on it without, I'm trying to highlight it without clicking on it, but there's 2015, there's the 10 for, not August, October, there's the 10 for October, and there's the 01 for the 1st of October. And we'll just ignore the last two zeros. And then we've got 2015, October, 31st of October. So for 2020, we're going to want, I'll put it in the chat, we're going to want those last two things to be 2020 01 01 00 and 2020 12 31 00. Does that make sense? So again, this is something you have to inspect, much as you would have to inspect a website to be able to work out how to access it, you have to inspect the documentation for an API to work out how to use it. But what we want to do is iterate over everything in our list and go through and collect the data. And then bind all that together, and then we'll have a data set. So I'm going to afterwards write the code for that. I'm not going to start doing that now because I will have to rush it and I won't get very far anyway. But what I'd like to ask is, does anyone have any questions on what we've done today, or in fact on anything else? If they're on, let's take ones on what we've done today first, and then if not, we can stop the recording and answer any other quick questions people might have.
I'll leave it a few more seconds for any questions.
Since we're recording, I will also quickly say, for anyone watching this back, we talked before the recording about the fact that there is a feedback form open. That will be open until Sunday, David?
Yeah, end of the week.
Yeah,
Sunday or something.
Yeah. So please fill that in. We are trying to make changes in response to that where we can do. So for instance, I've tried to take this code along a little bit slower, and I'll do that in future as well. That was one of the things that the initial feedback suggested, but we'd really like to get as much data as possible because this isn't a random sample. And so we can't say, well, 10% is representative because those were a self-selected 10%. So please do fill it in. And yeah, we really are listening to it. This isn't just a form that we have to do. Because, I mean, it is a form we have to do, but we're not just taking it in and doing it because we have to. We are looking at what you're saying and trying to do what we can.
Awesome. I think I'm going to stop recording. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. So I'll do that.